going to start share again. Okay, we are unlisted and I'm highlighted and we do want to share sound and we want to optimize. Okay, there's that. We are muted here. Okay, all systems are go. So here we are, week 5. This is the end of week 5B. The category is exoticism. We talked last week a little bit about breakdance and about the idea of othering people in order to um, use especially a national identity, because last week we talked about the World's Fair and how emerging cultures used the World's Fair to kind of get their hands into the pot of the international scene. So countries which had previously been colonized brought their newly formed national identity, and I put quotes on that because a lot of the time the where is everybody? Okay. A lot of the time, the identities of a new nation that had previously been colonized might be newly created out of multiple groups in an area that had previously been separate tribes or separate kingdoms. In Africa, for example, you often had multiple communities that were not one group until they got colonized and had to join together to get out of the oppression of colonization. And so colonized countries often had a newfound bond and a new reason to share their cultures and blend their cultures in order to create an international identity so that they could then eventually participate in things like what would become the United Nations, for example, right? So they're creating a sense of self by sharing their cultures, and sometimes that happened authentically from those people, and sometimes that happened because the colonizing cultures would like bring some things over and be like, hey, check out my artifact from this country that I own right now. So both of those things were true at the World's Fairs, but because we didn't have the internet or film, film was just beginning, and it was like, basically like flashing a bunch of, like a flip book was where film was at when the World's Fairs began. So most people's impressions of people from other countries were entirely created and invented from the World's Fairs, for example. So that was what we were talking about last time. And we ended discussing the, you could say, double-edged sword or two sides to the coin about being a performer in that context, where you, on one hand, are probably performing a version of your dance, since we're focusing on dance, which has been altered because putting it on the stage instead of a community setting, for one thing, will just alter it, right? If you're dancing with your community, you're probably all facing in a circle. We talked about the Bakongo cosmology shape and Gulagichi dances and how we can still see elements of that in community dances, such as like breakdancing that's happening in real life. And how if you put that on a stage, then, for example, the Native American dances that got put on a stage for the Wild West shows that Travel to See the Queen, then those circular shapes and formations and participation with your community then get all outward facing so that the performer can stand on the stage and perform towards the audience or the camera nowadays. And also, I'm gonna hold myself back from a big tangent here, but there was also a thing in the late 1800s, early 1900s called, no way, it's right there. There was a way of acting, which you will know from having seen little clips of like black and white films where people are basically overacting. So melodramas were all styled in this way where you were supposed to basically make body shapes that were basically used as sign language, so that if since you didn't have microphones, and then in early film you didn't have sound, that your body shape was making these classical signals to others that would convey emotion. And these body shapes were based on classical Greek statues. So of course white people then thought, that therefore means it's international. Ha ha ha. Perspective, right? But it would be like a Delsarchin. There's the thing. A Delsarchin pose, like I am proclaiming, or who is that over there, or oh my heart. And those elements of pantomime are definitely clear in also ballet and in all of the acting things. So if you think about our example of Black Elk talking to the Queen of England, who said, like, aren't you ashamed of the way that these people are, patronizing your native dances? And he was like, no, I'm just proud to tour the world and show my dance off. But he would have been doing the dance at home with his people, and it would have been transformed because there was a storyline to that Cowboys and Indians Wild West show, where he would have done part of his dances and then been like, oh no, we are fighting. I must be noble for my land. So these physical movements become part of the dance. Okay, so that's our recap. That's where we came from. So what we want to talk about now is the aesthetic of cool, which is put forward by an author named Thompson in this week's reading. And it's a deep lecture. I mean, it's a deep article, so hang in there. But I think it's so important because what he talks about, and this is an art critic. So this article is about how we can look at African art and identify this aesthetic, or this visual, and like the way that we value beauty, and in this case, the way that we value the idea of coolness in a format that comes from Africa. And this is important to our dance class because we're going to be talking about how we can visually identify the aesthetic of cool in dances as well as other art. And that skill that we're building of saying this is the African aesthetic of cool versus this is the European aesthetic of cool, which we never use that term, but I'm going to clarify the difference between the two today so that we can give credit where it's due when we see that kind of coolness in the world and in art. So this article is going to talk about the ways that the idea of valuing coolness happens in African culture and in several African cultures, and how that was expressed in both primitive, these are all really old statues that are down here, in ancient art from Africa, and also then you can see it in modern art. And so here's the idea. Coolness relates to water, and relates to ideas of whiteness. And by whiteness, I mean like the color white, not white people. So let's not get stuck on that topic too much. Just because I want to be clear. Coolness, in the sense of the African aesthetic of cool, relates to control over your emotions without stiffness, because we have this fluid idea of water put into it. The ideas of rinsing something clean, of focus of mind, but changeability. And that's the big thing I want us to focus on in terms of this, because when we think about coolness in terms of African culture, you want to imagine, I love this, I think it's on, is it this section? I think it's this section. So over here on page 42/4, he talks about the way that king in Africa would express his nobility by not dressing in a reserved manner, but really showing off a sense of fashion and loud clothing. That they would keep their emotions under control, not only in a stressful situation, and this is really the key for the emotional part, but also in a pleasurable situation. So for example, if you're at a dance party and you're approached by a person that you're sexually attracted to, and everybody's having a great time and like dancing their buns off and sweating and maybe freaking a little bit and like getting excited, the African aesthetic of cool here, that person would be demonstrating coolness, like, hey, how's it going? As opposed to like, hi, how's it going? Right? So that tamping of emotion is happening in a pleasurable situation as well as in a stressful situation. So here's a stressful situation example would be in, for example, a military or fighting situation to keep your emotions cool. So let's look at some ways that bodies move. Do we want to start there? We're going to go there. Let's look at this for a moment. So I figured this was pretty much as white as we can get, right? In this example, we have a military drill team, and all of them are doing what one could absolutely argue is a dance, right? Because this is clearly a choreography. We're using formations, we're using the same bodily movements, right? Nobody here has a face expressing anything at all. So pulled this one up. And this I thought was nice as an example because you can see their faces are totally without expression, right? But it doesn't seem cool to me. It seems cold. And that's sort of the terms that I use when I'm trying to differentiate between the idea of military, white Eurocentric coldness under pressure versus coolness. Like there's a stiffness. These guys could practically be doing the robot dance, right? And like, it kind of cracks me up how, let's see if I can get right to it. Watch how much of this choreography is like neck dancing. Isn't that just wild? What is that? Anyway, this is not cool. This is what I would say is cold. Both things are about control and facial, emotional, and bodily control, but one of them permits fluidity and demonstrates that you have emotions, but you sort of ride across a serene surface. This white version of emotional control is like denying that there's an emotional situation, even though this is supposed to be about, is this the changing of the guard? It's at the cemetery, right? This is a funeral. There are feelings at a funeral. But these guys are like, I don't have feelings. I am a machine. So I would say that is the difference between white coldness versus coolness. Now, there's so many pins open. So let's go to here. How this relates to the circus is that we want to talk about, last week we talked about the way that there's power in being othered, right? If you are seen as something that is other or exotic, so if you are exoticized by an audience, that gives you the power to command payment for performance, for example. So that is a huge part of acrobatics and circus performances. So that's what the fun content is that we're going to get to in terms of movement today. But let me just pause for a moment and see from you guys, does that idea of, let's say, like white cold versus African cool, does that make sense enough to move forward with it while we're looking at art? Or do you guys have questions? Oh, we got some thumbs up. Okay. Want to watch some fun videos now? Hi, Claire. No question, Claire? Question, Claire?
Sorry, I'm here messing with the control bottom here. Yeah, I'm still kind of digesting it all. It's not that I'm confused, but I might have confusion after we see a few more videos or pictures here.
Totally. So, and you have that article, right, to read the Thompson article. So that'll really dive into specific examples of like the visual idea of water and color and purity and like fluidity, but power over the top of it. So like the deep dive is in the article, but the surface simplification is Frozen, like you know nothing, Jon Snow, versus I've got this. I see you over there. I'm in control of myself, right? Look at the different aesthetic for sure. And that said, let's get to some examples. Here's my button. Okay. Ooh, that's fun. Share multiple videos option. Okay, so I think I put these in opposite order. Let's start here. So this is, I'm going to let us have some sound from here. This is from the movie Stormy Weather, so 1940. It's colorized. This person that I took, those men are not actually blue.
Boy, what's gonna say that gay? Oh boy, what's gonna say that gay? Shalimar, Swanee Shore. Let me dig this jive once more, boy. Right on down to Gator.
Have you guys seen this yet? Nicholas Brothers. It's Acrobatic. This is probably the most famous performance that they ever did. And you can see that they have done this performance before, and it's been done in other places, so it was like sort of refined and polished for this movie. But the Nicholas Brothers were... Calloway, you're great, but I'm going to move us on. So the Nicholas Brothers were vaudeville stars. They traveled all around the country performing their act, and it's a tap dance acrobatic. So there they are. I'm going to let them speak. So, no, it's so good. They're so amazing. So, notice their faces, right? They are sweating, but they just look like they're having a nice time. It's cool. So some of the other elements that are great to look at in this are a two-sided stairwell. Where do we see that? Bojangles' most famous act, right? What is Bojangles also known for? Is he took tap dancing from like really downward heavy footwork. Remember we talked about those the like stomping buck dances that tap dance first evolved from, and how Bojangles took it, made the action upright, wore suits, and socially climbed. Like those, that double-sided stairwell is essentially a metaphor, a physical metaphor for climbing society, right? And not only do these guys climb up and down with no ease, and they are totally cool about falling down the stairs without being able to, or without being injured, but they like add their own little ending of like coolly slithering down the bottom at the end. So remember in the 1920s, we have the Harlem Renaissance going on, right? So this dance was recorded, is Stormy, I want to say it's 43. So 20s to 40s, jazz age is ending at like the jazz age as we think about it kind of ends with the market crash, 1939, right? The war is happening, but in America we haven't quite gotten into the war yet. So in the early 1940s, we're basically just like starting to finally recover from the market crash because we're making money selling munitions. 1943, we've gone to war at this point, but we're not in the poor section that we were in everybody in the whole world was in 1930. So, sorry, did I say 39? Market crash, 29. Great Depression, 8 years after that. So we're out of the Great Depression here, but this act has probably been performed on the road for the last, I would guess probably they've been doing it for at least 5 years by this time. So, these men have social power, social clout. They're dressed up to the nines, but their act is giving a wink and a nod to upper class and lower class, and their ability to transcend and work up and down both, which was kind of like it was sort of the whole nugget of the jazz age, because America finally was like totally obsessed with Black culture from the 1920s and going on. That giant big band and America and Europe's desire to dance to jazz music was a huge part of what opened the doors and started breaking up segregation during that time. So all of this is like really a metaphor about that transition in Black cultures taking the main stage. Getting onto the floor and getting back up again was not something you saw white people do. Right? But to lead into our conversation about circus is this acrobatic work, right? And the acrobatic work itself comes from usually martial backgrounds, right? And that's not always the case all around the world, but a lot of acrobatic work initially comes from martial training. So let's hop over here and take a quick moment here with...
All right, coming up in number 1, capoeira. Capoeira is by far the most well-known and widespread of the African arts. Capoeira was practiced in Brazil by enslaved Africans and is a unique dance fight game favoring strategy and cunning, and is based on indigenous fighting arts from Central Africa such as the Nsenga and the Ngolo. The art features dynamic dance-like footwork, fluid evasions, acrobatics, as well as kicks, sweeps, takedowns, and headbutts. All of this accompanied to percussive instruments from West and Central Africa. The chief amongst them is the beating bow or the musical bow. All right, coming up in our number 2
I'm gonna pop us out of here. There's 4 more of these forays into martial arts. I just found this morning, so I will add it to our list. You guys have seen capoeira in some form? Yes, no, maybe? No. Oh! Oh! All right, pause, Amber. Pause, pause, pause. All right, well, I was going to check in with those guys. Ah, here we go. So, capoeira is, as the gentleman said previously, a martial art that evolved from with the slaves who came over in the Middle Passage, and it's mostly known from its basis now in training is in Brazil, and it's, I bet there's sound here. So usually you do it in a cipher. There's people in a circle, and there are people playing drums, and it's absolutely like there's a constant step that happens. These are like all flips and tricks that are taken. To find one with a bunch of women. Usually all these videos are all men. There's drums on the right there. Let's pause here for a second. What else do we have anything else? No. Okay. Does that give you a little bit of a gist? We could go all the way down this rabbit hole forever and it would be fabulous.
Yeah, I like that. That was cool.
It's pretty amazing, and it's great to see it live. I haven't watched this yet. Oh, look at this. There's our cosmogram.
Rasa Malik, and today I'm going to be doing a video, instructional video on martial arts, aka Mantu arts, African Mantu arts. This time we're going to be talking about footwork, and footwork is probably...
Pause. I mean, I'm excited about this.
Now I'm going to bend my knees, and this is going to be my active, ready, base position. So from here, I'm going to show you the Jinga. Jinga is from Capoeira, which is an Afro-Brazilian Mantu art. And in this, you go back, and then you go forward. Back, and then you go forward. Back, and you sway. This is what's called a Jinga. And there's many different variations. I can go into a Regional Jinga. I can go into an Angola Jinga. You know, I could do any type of Jinga where I'm just, you know, I'm just walking down the street, I'm just standing at the corner, you know, Jinga. That's the Jinga. The Jinga is very similar to the falso from Eskrima con Machete, which is machete fencing from Colombia. I'm gonna show you what that looks like. So from the base position, same one, where you can see my whole body and you can feel the bend in your legs. You're gonna do the same movement as the Jinga, except it's inverted. That means instead of going back stepping, you're gonna be stepping forward to the point of the triangle. And by the way, you're gonna be making triangles with all of these movements. That's the shape that you wanna keep in your mind when you're doing footwork for these arts. Triangle. So put my front foot on the tip of the triangle to the base of the triangle. Other leg goes to the tip, back to the base. And I'm here, you know? Normally I would have a stick, a machete, and here's where I'm flowing. This is my movement, right? So instead of doing this, I'm going back, forward in the base. I'm going back into the base, forward one step. Back into the base, forward one step. Back into the base, forward one step. And that's so, just an example of how it's used, that's so you can get into a rhythm of slicing, attacking, and going back and defending yourself with a parry or a block. So that's the second form of footwork.
Okay. I want to watch that. Does that give you a little window into how those martial arts are a foundation of both capoeira and also the acrobatic movement that we saw like integrated into the tap dancing that we saw with the Nicholas brothers? So that is absolutely true. Also, I don't know if you see this, but this looks to me so much like a huge part of early b-boying. Right? Like if you think about the up rock where you're stepping forward, it's to the point of that triangle, right? And it's not like there aren't those kinds of steps in other places. There are. Sometimes things look the same. Sometimes things come from obvious roots. And I would say those are pretty obvious breakdance step roots. You could argue it. Okay, so that covers acrobatics. That covers, what's the other thing that we need to get into? Okay, the other thing we need to get into is circuses. What were circuses doing? So in the I should have a date for this, but I don't think I do. In the early American times, we have pioneers coming and settling the America, you know, all that genocide, kicking out the native people. We have the slave trade bringing Black, soon-to-be Americans into America. And at that time, most of America was either industrializing in the big cities. So, right, we have steam engines, we have steam factories, we have, on the other side, we have rural life. So things, almost everybody before the Industrial Revolution used to live essentially on a farm because that's what people did. And the Industrial Revolution and the invention of steam power and trains caused this great migration of people away from rural life and into towns. And this is important in America because it plays into our sense of North versus South. The North was seen as a cold, as in white coldness, get yourself in line, get in that factory, be the same menial, like do the same action over and over again, industrial life, which was seen as sort of removing the heart from the human experience. And then the South was seen as this place of, obviously this is a white perspective, this place of warmth and naturalness and getting back to the land. You know, also slavery and genocide and torture, blah, blah. All of these elements are conflicting and all are true. So that's sort of where we're at in the late 1700s, but definitely 1800s. Is this contrast in life between the wonder and opportunity presented by Industrial Revolution versus the farm life. And during this time, before film, entertainment traveled in caravans, and this would be the time of either early vaudeville and also circus. And sometimes those things overlapped. So did any of you guys, probably not, I know because this show's getting old at this point. Also, by the way, this is a great YouTube search. If you want to try that out. I was like, oh, I want to watch 17 things here. Carnival, HBO. So there has not been, I keep coming back here to kind of look at, I'm hoping one day we're going to have the dance scenes show up, but HBO is pretty good at not letting us do it. So Carnival, this show was set, it's an HBO show that is from the early 2000s. It's set in the time of the American Dust Bowl. I'm just going to leave it muted behind so you get some visuals here, because that's the part that I really love about the show. Also, it's magical. So this is like early 1930s, and the entertainment, this circus, is traveling in a bunch of trucks. You can see them in the background. And they would go from town to town, set up circus tents, and perform. So circuses would have, quote unquote freaks, which would be people of differing bodies. And so I'm trying not to get into that huge, excellent tangent of a conversation about exoticizing the body, right? So much to talk about there. They would have card readers, they would have musicians, they would have, maybe if you had animals, you would have animal trainers, and also dance and acrobatic performances, right? We think about trapezes and juggling. We probably don't think about cooch shows, but that's the thing I'm always hoping will show up on YouTube one day, because there's not a good edit of it. Do we have... No. Just one day. Anyway, fire breathing. That show is awesome. I love it. When those circuses traveled, they brought all kinds of different movement from different communities and shared it in the way that, like, the internet does now. So your early pre-vaudeville shows would be the same, and performers would either go on tour with like a circus or an early vaudeville show, which are close to the same thing, or they might perform in saloons, right? We all know what a saloon is. Or in big cities, that's where you start to have vaudeville shows being put on stage and becoming permanent. But most entertainers were travelers during early America. And so remember, we talked about last week, Little Egypt, the belly dancer. This is real footage, 1896, scandalizing and enchanting America and beyond, and how there were like probably a good 100 or 200 impersonators going by her name at that time. So this is the actual female dancer. She's got, I don't know, she may or may not have a thin layer of cloth over her belly while she's doing this dance, but either way, this is absolutely scandalous for Victorian people at the time. And so this became the inspiration for the quote-unquote cooch dances, which would be female dancers in circuses who were strippers, essentially, right? And often sex workers. So they took this dancing from the World's Fair, and this is Princess Raja dancing, was her stage name, doing a more East Indian inspired, one thinks, dance. Oh yes, the chair. Right? You can see how this is a circus act to our perception of what goes into a circus. Was this actually a woman from the Middle East doing her native dance that then became quote unquote exoticized and part of what we think of as circus acts in America? Yeah. And she's pretty dang impressive. I can't do that. I don't know about you guys. So these are the elements that go into what combines with the community dances that we've seen come over from Africa. Those people doing the buck dances that evolve into the tap dances. Those tap dancers and acrobatics trading skills and sharing skills on the pre-vaudeville and also circus stages. And all of these elements are eventually going to merge through into what becomes jazz dance. So that said, I thought we'd just poke around here in the background with some circus acts because it's amazing. This one is Curios. It's Cirque du Soleil. It's a group of international performers based out of Canada, Montreal. Most of their lyrics, and not all of their shows, but a lot of their shows are not in any particular language. All of them just Cirque du Soleil tends to do themed shows which have a fantastical but also location oriented theme a lot of the time. So like this one is about a fantasy steampunk circus. So it's really about like clockwork and belief. No, I just almost expressed my own whiteness and erasure there. It is probably more European culturally influenced, right? As opposed to open up the other one. I hope I still have the other one open. As opposed to I probably don't. There's Ka in Vegas right now, which has a much more. Oh, I was looking for the. Oh, that's why my search is not working. Yeah. So they did one that was based on Mexico recently. Lucia, it's gorgeous. But it does inevitably raise these questions of appropriation. I mean, I think they hired. It's definitely like a cast worldwide sort of scenario, but are these a bunch of people from Mexico? No. But it's amazing art. I think they do a really good job of being respectful, but you might not think that that's true in 4 years. I don't know. It'd be an interesting thing to see how Cirque du Soleil ages in that context. The point really of me sort of taking you here to modern circus is to give you a connection, right, between the acrobatic works that we saw, also the elements of sex work, because I mean, like, what's going on here? We have pole dancing, right? Which this is obviously not sex work, but we think of pole dancing traditionally in America, for example, as relating to sex work because pole dancing has for so long been something that until maybe 10 years ago was only done by strippers. And strippers are dancers who may or may not be sex workers, but we generally assume that they're sex workers in this country. And part of that assumption relates not only to outfits and facts of there being an overlap in that Venn diagram, but also to our national impression of performers being sex workers that dates back to Victorian responses to seeing world dances in the World's Fair. Also, the oppression of women and people whose bodies were othered by white culture, because when those bodies are not in the mainstream upper class, then you can pay for them to do things that you want. And they're also in a position economically that makes them more desperate to earn money by doing things that make business work. And also that because of societal class rules, like a white Victorian woman, for example, would not try out a quote-unquote exotic dance. There's just like, man, I'm just like trying to find the right words for this, right? Because of all these standards that we have. So we're going to expand our discussion here from exoticizing the body, that acrobatic trick that extreme ability was related in our country's mind to circus acts, traveling people, and other bodies. And we're going to talk in the next, now 2 sections from now, we'll come back to this idea about how sexuality is also other. But one thing that's important to state here is that the Black body in America in particular was exoticized and eroticized, because if Black men were considered the lowest and most purchasable chattel in America at the time of slavery, then Black women were even less human considered at that time, because they were also rapeable. And so, well, how are we ending on this point? The idea that their bodies were not their own is the flip side of the coin of what leads us to the power in a self-controlled, well-dressed, extraordinarily physically able performance like the Nicholas brothers, because that dichotomy is so powerful and so valuable aesthetically. And really, you see that valued in many, many cultures, but in our American culture, that's how that dichotomy grew, is out of slaves really taking their bodies back. So that is our deep thought of the day. How I'd love you to think about what the watching goes on this week is to think about this question. Maybe we can spend our last 4 minutes answering this question together. Is, have you experienced being called other, or have you experienced having your dancing or movement or art being called other? And did you ever see power in that? Or, flip side example, have you had that experience of othering seeming magical, dangerous, and desirable? Anybody want to throw an idea out there? Or are we still like, Amber, what are you talking about? That's a valid response too. What do you guys think? This is a no wrong answers thing. Claire, do you want to share? You're unmuted.
Well, I don't think it's so much that there's a wrong and a right answer, but I think we're talking about some pretty sensitive stuff here. So, there might be, people might take offense. Okay, different people that are going to be watching this later. But yeah, I do remember a time when I had kind of a dual type experience like that went on for some time. When I was traveling through different parts of India. Mm-hmm. I had lived there for many years, and there were definitely times when, okay, being white, even the way I spoke English, was considered exotic. And there were those that were, wanted to be close to that or wanted a piece of that. And on the flip side, I was beat up. I was kept from going certain places. But that was, I think, mostly, the leftovers of, on both sides, the leftovers of the British colonization, that had happened, because they did accept, and still to this day, still continue, to engage in all kinds of things that were forced upon them at that time. But then some of it they liked and they kept. But I did experience that, that dual thing where, I was seen, as dirty, malecha. A lot of the Indian people consider anyone who's from cultures of meat eating, for instance, to be barbarians and of a lower class.
Have any of you guys, I think I mentioned this on the first date, seen that book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent?
Yeah.
It's mind-blowing, but she really talks about the caste system in India and in comparison to the way that our racism and our racist culture works in America, because it's so much more complex than it's important to acknowledge how complex society's stratification and separation of cultures is, and that just reminded me of that. How about you, gentlemen? Anybody want to take a foray?
Yeah. When I used to, well, I still play basketball, just not for my school. So when I was playing for my middle school, I just remember the coach was like, "Oh, like we don't play street ball here, whatever," just because I had different moves than other people.
Ooh, awkward.
Yeah.
That's interesting. What kind of moves was he talking about?
I have no idea. Maybe just other people were playing more conservatively, like, oh, pass the ball here.
Mm.
And maybe I was doing a move that was more fancy or flashy or something like that. He was just saying like kind of it didn't fit in the system of their play style.
Right. Because it's his job, right, to like choreograph passing in a way that you can communicate with your team. But if your style was more based on like making sure that you got a point and that prioritized like passing it to the guy over there, is that maybe what he meant?
No, I mean, maybe a little bit, but I mean, I still passed the ball. It's not like I was just all about myself. It just was like my style of playing, I guess, was just different, I guess.
Interesting. That's a great example. Wow. I know like nothing about basketball, y'all. So that was my best attempt at understanding. Do you think that your flashy moves also were admired at the same time?
Maybe, yeah, but I mean, at the end of the day, they want stuff that fits along with the team. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like sometimes teams have a reputation or image, like they're more conservative teams, and you have more aggressive teams that are like they just want to score. Some teams they want to set up a play, they want to pass here, pass there,
Right.
and not really too much going on. And then the other teams, they just anybody who has the opportunity to score, take advantage of it, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. It reminds me also of the way that so many athletes now are like also superstars, and how there are probably more conservative teams, and then there are other teams that like hire stars who are like supposed to shine and look funny or like do special unique, like people who have like an end zone dance that's their end zone dance that is like their trademark that brings them personal attention. And that's that like idea of like your finesse and your style on the court or on the field brings attention, brings power to that particular player. But there's also that counter push to like fall in line, be more conservative. Yeah. Patrick, do you have a thought? Oh, I can't hear you for some reason. You're unmuted, but mysterious. Are you unplugged? No?
Nothing.
Ah! No, that was Claire.
Sorry. Sorry.
Well, we'll let you fiddle with that. I would love you guys to take into the next week this question of whether the dances that you're watching are appearing cool, or anything else that you watch. Like, as an aesthetic marker on anything that you watch in the next week, I'd love you to come back with an example of something that was or was not cool. Oh, I hear clicking happening over there, Patrick.
No, right?
Oh,
Ah!
You're back.
Woo!
I
is
just
he
had to
there?
take my iPhone off.
Here he is.
Yeah. I wasn't mostly called this, but when I was in band playing for percussion, we were like at the front ensemble, the pit area. We were mostly called the smart people because we don't have to march at all. We had to carry instruments. Yeah.
The smart people. I can identify with that with my baritone saxophone in the marching band.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd love you guys to think about bringing an example this when I see you next week about something that you identify as cool and like how that looks cool to you. Or if you see something that doesn't look cool that really stands out. That would be a really great thing to talk about. And let's take a peek at what's up next week. Oh, we're going to talk about the Africanist presence in American dance. Whoop, whoop. And we're finally going to watch that social dance video. That's this one. And then we'll talk more about ragtime and the swing era. Great. Cool. Any questions, concerns, thoughts, closing, anything?
The example that we're going to bring for next week, how are we going to get that onto Zoom? Like through a link?
You can just, if you want to share a video, you can totally share with a link. If you,
Oh, okay.
You can just bring, this magic button right here. Boop, boop,
Where's
boop,
the
boop.
magic button? I'm looking.
If you're in YouTube, it's this share arrow.
Oh, okay.
That's the short link, because sometimes longer links, especially if you're on a mobile phone, like up here the URL, they don't paste quite as well. But this short link is always.
Oh, okay. So something short.
Well, I mean, yeah. And also just to talk about, like, I'd love to just talk with you guys a little bit about, like, what does cool mean to you? What does cool look like in one of the dances? We like to just continue to identify this aesthetic of cool. And because next week we're going to expand upon 4 other aesthetics within. The article is about concert dance, so she's going to talk about jazz elements in ballet, but we're going to look at it in terms, like, look at all other dances with those 5 elements, one of which is the aesthetic of cool. And then there's 4 more. And they're kind of like aesthetic markers that something has developed out of African cultural values. Aesthetic cultural values, I should say. Yeah? Okay, great. Thank you, guys. This is tangential, but I'd just like to say sometimes I, especially lately as a professor, make jokes about myself or apologize or like let my mistakes hang out, because I think that is opening and inviting to my students. That's my hope, right? Like, hey, I'm human. We're all human here. Like, let's make mistakes together. But I think, and I have been thinking this week about it, that it might be important for me to acknowledge that is a tactic that I use in my discussion with students, being imperfect, being open that way. Because when we're talking about race, it could be misconstrued, or I could be making the mistake of coming across as like a white guilt scenario, especially when I'm like struggling to find the right vocabulary to explain something in history, like today, for example. And I just want to make it clear that like I am a human being who makes mistakes, and that I am very comfortable with, but I don't mean to come across as if I'm being jovial about my mistakes or my inability to express myself, especially on topics of race. That's not supposed to be an expression of white guilt or like, oh, it's so hard that I'm doing this work of talking about that. That would be straight BS. So, right, like I'm a person of privilege. It's important to acknowledge that, and that I apologize if I do sometimes come across as not taking that seriously or pretending like it's hard. It's not my burden. So I just want to throw that out there because it occurred to me that that could happen. So I'm going to keep trying to do my best. All right. Thank you for staying over, guys. I don't want to keep you. But if you have any questions, I will hang out for a little bit. So I will let you guys log out first. And I'll see you next week.
Thank you. Have a good weekend.
Hey,
Thank you.
you too.